Good morning, everybody. Let's get started. So we are in session 7 this week, and we were reading through the epistle to the Romans. So this is one of Paul's undisputed letters, so we are sure that Paul wrote this. Interestingly, the way that the disciple curriculum is laid out, we are not reading Paul's letters in the order that they were written. So the New Testament is not in chronological order. The letters in the New Testament are arranged by size, longest to shortest. So that's just when you're thinking and reading through them, and you say, this doesn't have any sense of logical progression from one to the other. Correct. There's not a clear development of thought because you're dealing with all different times. Also, they're being written to different communities. So each letter should really be taken as its own message. So they're not, Paul's not attempting to have one line of thought. But if you do want to kind of trace the development of Paul's thought, I would recommend grabbing some kind of academic book that dates the letters in the New Testament and read through them in that order. That would be the way to really see the way that Paul's thought changes, evolves, develops over the couple decades that he's writing these letters. But just reading through the New Testament in the way that we are, it's not going to be super evident. So when we're looking at Romans, this is actually kind of in the middle chronologically of Paul's writings. Our clue for dating the book of Romans is in chapter 16, where Paul greets Prisca and Aquila, who are back in Rome. And we heard about them in Acts chapter 18, where Prisca is called Priscilla. Now, those are the same people. Priscilla is a diminutive of the name Prisca. It's like how you would call someone whose name is Jean, Jeannie. So Prisca, Priscilla. So those are different forms of the same name. So Prisca or Priscilla and Aquila, they show up as very important early Christian leaders in the church of Corinth because they were exiled from Rome. And by the time that Paul is writing to the Romans, they seem to be back in the city. Now, that helps us date this letter because the exile of the Jews from Rome happens under the Emperor Claudius in 49 AD. That edict was reversed around 54 when Nero came into power. So this letter has to be dated sometime after 54 AD. And it's before Paul was arrested. And he's not in Rome yet, obviously. And this is not, it doesn't seem to be, at least based on what's in it, one of his prison letters. So that gives us a probable range for this being sometime between 55 and 60 AD. Because remember, Paul is usually thought to have been executed in the mid-60s after being in house arrest in Rome for several years. So we're looking 55 to 60 AD, so right in the middle of Paul's ministry. Now, Romans is interesting in its context because it is a letter that Paul is writing to a community that he did not found. So other of Paul's letters, those are his churches. Romans is being written to a community that he is not the pastor or the bishop of, right? They don't even know him personally. So as we read on in the New Testament, especially next week with Paul's correspondence with the Corinthian church, you're going to see him speak very bluntly, right? Paul's letters to the Corinthians have directives. You need to be doing this. People doing this are wrong. Doesn't happen so much in Romans. Paul is much gentler, much more calm and thought out in his message to the Romans. Paul is basically sending this letter ahead of him to introduce himself and his beliefs to the Romans, and he's really only touching on he gets into it with length, but he is not condemning anyone in Rome based on their current controversies. Because remember that as the Jews are coming back into the city of Rome, there is conflict between the Gentile church that has been kind of left to its own devices during that exile, and now the Jewish Christians are returning, and we have this disagreement that Romans takes a long time to deal with between the nature of salvation and the relationship of the Gentile Christians to the law of Moses. This is still one of the things that church is dealing with as these Jewish Christians return. But he's not being abrasive like we're going to see him be later on, because the whole purpose of him sending this ahead of him is so that when he comes to Rome, he's planning on coming to Rome, he wants them to support him in the future, right? Both personally and financially. He is trying to send this letter to garner goodwill with the people in that community and to kind of lay out his theology so that they will receive him and support him in a future missionary journey to Spain. Remember, at this stage of church development, the church was not formally connectional. So like today, if I as a Methodist pastor in Eldersburg go around the world, if there's a United Methodist presence in that country, I am still acknowledged as a credentialed Methodist pastor anywhere I go, right? Same thing with the Roman Catholics, right? An American priest has the same privileges at a Roman Catholic church in Japan, right? In Paul's day, there is not yet an institutional church across areas, right? So Paul had to convince the Roman church that he is an apostle. He has to convince the Roman church that they need to accept his call from God and his commissioning by the Antioch church. He has to convince them that they should be supporting him financially and supporting his missionary activities. So Paul, writing to Rome, is trying to get them on board with what he's doing as someone who they've never met, right? So this would be like if a missionary from elsewhere wrote a letter to us and said, I'm planning to come to Eldersburg. Will you support me financially in my further mission? Here's what I believe. So that's what Paul is doing to this Roman church. And here's Paul's argument, right? Here's how Paul understands kind of the nature of salvation and how Paul is going to introduce himself as looking at the controversy, right, between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians that are currently happening in that Roman church. So here's the arc of Paul's argument. Paul begins with the human condition. Paul says that all humans, just by looking at nature, should be able to reason the basic attributes of God and a moral law. So Paul begins with a very optimistic view of what humans should be able to do, right? Paul says that humans should be able to know things about God on their own without God's revelation to them. Right? He says nature should let people know about God's basic attributes, right? Not necessarily his personality, but that there is a God, so basically the God of the philosophers, Paul is saying everyone should be able to get there. But Paul also says that more than just, people happen to have sinned. No, Paul says that all of humanity is enslaved to the power of sin. So we are unable to do the right thing. So everyone is in this state. Both Jews and Gentiles are held captive by a force that is beyond us that he calls sin, right? So this is where the church in later centuries will look at what does original sin mean, right? It is that everyone is captive to the power of sin. On our own, we are unable to live righteously because we are compelled to sin. Okay. This leads to the consequence of death. So, you know, the famous aphorism, the wages of sin is death. So, death is God's wrath against sin. So, if you look at sin, right, as a power, sin as a power chains us to mortality. So God says that if you're sinning, the punishment is death. We cannot help but sin because we are enslaved. So everyone is under God's wrath because everyone will die. Does that make sense? Okay. So then he turns to the law. What's the deal with the law of Moses? So Paul says that God sends the law to reveal God's will. But because we are enslaved to sin, we do not have the capacity to follow the law. If we could follow the law, we could be righteous before God. But because the law doesn't empower anyone to follow it, then the law itself cannot make us righteous. Paul does seem to think that if we were not enslaved to sin, if we had our full rationality and capacity, and we followed the law to the letter, that would be a way of living that would be righteous. The issue is, just being told what to do does not give us the ability to actually do it. Sin chains us and prevents us from doing it, and therefore the law is unable on its own to make us righteous. And then on top of that, because we are enslaved to the power of sin, the law becomes an occasion for further sinning. Because when we are told, don't do that, our master, sin, compels us to break that commandment. So what happens with Jesus? Basically, Jesus comes and dies when he doesn't have to. So remember, the wages of sin are death. God's wrath against sin is mortality. Jesus doesn't sin. Jesus is God. So Jesus subjects himself to that consequence of sin, death, when he doesn't have to. So that is his ransom to the forces of sin. So again, that ransom language that Paul uses, he's continuing on that metaphor of someone who is enslaved being purchased out of slavery. So if someone was enslaved, you could ransom them out of slavery. So Jesus, freely subjecting himself to death, ransoms us out of slavery. And then Jesus is raised from the dead. So Paul says that because of that, when we are baptized, we join him in that death, right? So baptism is what gives us access to that ransom, right? It frees us from our enslavement to sin, and then we become united to Christ, And because Christ was raised and we are united to Christ, then we are brought through death and out the other side. Right? So you notice that this is not just saying that we are forgiven. We are justified, made righteous. So when we are united to Christ, we are first taking advantage of Christ's own righteousness. But the idea is not just that when God looks at us, God credits it to us that Christ was righteous. That is part of it. But there's also the sense that being united to Christ is supposed to make us righteous too. Right? So what Christ is, we become. The same thing with resurrection, right? What Christ is, died and risen, we will become died and risen. Paul also says that because the law, any law, is only binding on someone as long as they live, then anyone who is baptized is spiritually dead and resurrected. So spiritually dead means that law is no longer binding on them, which means that whatever residual sin is trying to tempt us to, we're told not to do it, then sin tempts us to say, do it anyway. There's nothing else that is trying to say, don't do that. Instead, the new way we live is to positively try to become like Christ, because we are united to Christ. So let's look at a few themes in Paul's thought, because that arc of salvation is going to come up again, especially when we read Galatians. So this was just kind of a primer on what Paul is also going to be writing to us later in this course. So let's look at some themes in Paul's thought. The first of these is life and death. So as I said, Paul doesn't talk much about the afterlife, right? Paul doesn't mention heaven and hell a whole lot, right? The Gospels, incredibly full of Jesus talking about the kingdom of heaven, which is both kind of that celestial realm and what will eventually happen on earth. But Jesus in the Gospels does talk about, reward or punishment after death. Paul doesn't focus on that. Paul's focus is on death being the wrath of God that Christ saves us from, right? Paul doesn't say Christ took on God's wrath and so he suffered in hell for us, right? No, he says Christ was subjected to God's wrath. He died. Therefore, when we die with Christ and are brought out of death into resurrection. So Christ opens the door to resurrection and a new body, not necessarily heaven, right? So Paul is kind of silent on what happens to us as soon as we die, right? Paul is only focused on the resurrection and to a body and the life in the world to come. The second theme in Paul's thought that I want to bring out is this idea of nature and the natural law. So as we kind of heard before earlier, Paul has kind of this early doctrine of a natural law, what people should figure out based on nature, right? So Paul thinks that it should just be obvious if people look that there is a God and what God wants us to do based on nature. Now, I want you to pay attention of all of the places that Paul makes an argument from nature throughout his letters. Because I just want to warn you that when Paul talks about what is natural, all that means is that seems obvious to him. Right? When we read his arguments about things that are clearly natural, you're going to find things in other letters that we are going to wildly disagree with today, right? Because we don't believe that that's necessarily a regulation by God that is written into nature, right? Much of what Paul thinks is naturally clear is not self-evident to us. It's also not self-evident to many people in his day. So just so it's in your mind, when Paul says nature, what Paul means is, I'm not going to give you an argument, it just seems this way to me. Let's look at predestination and election, because throughout church history, Romans, and especially chapters 8 and 9, get poured over by theologians because of these interesting terminological phrases Paul uses, especially predestination, election, vessels of wrath, right? Like, the fact of the matter is, Romans 8 and 9 have nothing to do with individual Christian salvation. That whole chapter has nothing to do with God choosing someone to be saved and choosing someone to be damned. It has nothing to do with looking throughout the world today and asking, who is predestined, right? The only way that people actually think that is to take that out of the context of the entire letter. Because when read in the context of what Paul is writing, those chapters are talking about suffering and how Christians deal with suffering in the present age. And then we start with Paul's explanation for how Israel and the promise to God's people fits in with the gift of the gospel in Jesus Christ. And here's what I mean by that. In Romans 8, all of that beginning part of that chapter is Paul saying, how are we supposed to deal with the fact that we're still suffering? Right? Then, by the time we get to anything about predestination, Paul has just been saying, this suffering is the groaning of labor pains. Something new is coming. The whole thing about predestination is just Paul saying, what you are going through right now, that's not God's power not working. Be patient because you have all been destined to become like Christ. Right? It's saying that what we're going through right now is bad, but God has given a sure promise, predestined, that you who believe will someday be glorified like Christ is. Even at its most literal, Paul is saying that those who God foreknew are going to be predestined to be like Christ. So even at its most literal, it's that God is outside of time, and so God knows who will freely choose to believe. And because God knows that, right, God has said, anyone who freely chooses to believe, even though they suffer in this life, I am destining them. Those who I know will believe. The goal is that they will be like Christ, and that is a sure, destined promise. Those who he foreknew, he called and justified, right? So foreknowledge, when we think about the debate on are some predestined, the literal words of Paul is that God foreknows. And those who God foreknows, regardless of the sufferings in this life, will be predestined to become like Christ. So the whole thing has to do with Paul saying that suffering will be made better for sure. Now, chapter 9 has to deal not with individuals being chosen to be redeemed or rejected. Paul is trying to argue what it means for the Jews to be elected and for some people to not be elected. Paul says that those who have been elected, so the children of God, they're not elected in general, they're elected for a purpose. And that purpose is to be the people through whom God's promises will be fulfilled. And that promise is Christ, right? So when we look at those who have been elected to be children of God, he's talking specifically about those who would be the ancestors of Christ, those who would have the honor of being the ones through whom the Son of God will come into the world, right? They are the ones that are heirs of that promise. That's why he gets into this whole thing to say, well, already, in the womb, one I have chosen and one I have hated. It's that the one that's chosen is the one who would be the progenitor of Christ. It's not all Abraham's children. It's not all of Israel. It's one tribe, one people. He's talking about the people who would be the people of Christ. Now, notice that whenever Paul talks in chapter 9 about those who were made to be vessels of wrath, he then says, and the people that seem to have been rejected by God, those are the ones that God is having mercy on now, right? The ones who are vessels of wrath, that's how they seem, because they are not the people of Christ, but they are in fact being brought in. They are the Gentiles, right? When Paul's talking about the objects of wrath, he's talking about the Gentiles who are being brought in. And even those who were chosen, because they have stumbled, because some did not accept Christ, God seems to be even turning that upside down. So the ones who seemed to be objects of wrath are brought in, and the ones that seemed to have been chosen by God, some of them are not being brought in. So the talk about predestination is basically overblown. Paul is not making any argument about what God is doing before the foundation of the world to choose some people to be saved and making everybody else damned. He's making a very specific argument to say, those, again, outside of time, God knows who is going to believe, and that's the people that Paul is writing to. God knew you would believe, and God has promised that you will become glorified like Christ. Right? It's an assurance, it's a comfort. And then in chapter 9, his whole thing is those who were chosen and elected by the free grace of God were elected to be those through whom Christ would come. Right? Everybody else who seemed to be rejected by God because they are not the people through whom Christ would come, well, right now, God is showing incredible mercy on them and bringing them in. Okay, last two themes in Paul's thought. You might have to flip your paper over. Paul, compared to the Gospels, might be a universalist. And here's what I mean by that. Paul does not have any doctrine of heaven and hell, at least not one that's clearly thought out. Compared to the Gospels, Paul definitely leans towards universalism, or the belief that everyone will be saved eventually. He says this specifically and clearly for the Jews, right? Romans 11:26 says, all Israel will be saved. He doesn't know how, right? He seems to say that eventually they will need to accept Christ, but in some mystery of God, all Israel will be saved. So that's the promise that it seems that Paul is being kind of incredibly gracious to, that even some that reject Christ eventually somehow will be saved. But we also get verses about all humans too. Like Romans 5:18, just as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. Paul moves back and forth in this work between saying that we are saved by grace through being baptized according to our faith, but then whenever he says that Christ undoes what Adam did, he applies that to all humanity. So there's this tension in Paul's work where he seems to be wrestling with this fact that says, no, Christ and what Christ did and being baptized into Christ, that's how we work out our salvation. But he's also wrestling with this idea that if Christ is undoing the power of sin, then just as Adam's sin spread to all humans, shouldn't Christ's justification spread to all humans? And so that part of Paul's theology never finds resolution in his letters. There is a tension in Paul between, it seems like he really wants to be a universalist. He really wants to say that Christ's sacrifice is just going to justify everyone, the free grace of God. And yet he can't quite work out how that can happen outside of baptism. So that's why with the Jews, he says, I literally don't know how this is going to happen. I don't get it. I don't understand. It's a mystery, but I really believe all Israel will be saved. He does the same thing for all of humanity, just a little bit more subtle, right? He says, there will be justification and life for all. Oh, but you got to be baptized. Oh, but Christ is undoing Adam's sin, but we're saved through faith in Christ. He doesn't work it out, right? And we mostly gloss over that because we don't like it when in one biblical book written by one guy, there's these tensions. But that's a real tension that exists in Paul's work. Okay, lastly, Paul on the place of women in the New Testament. So the letters in the New Testament do not speak in one voice regarding the place of women in leadership in the church. Unsurprising. Romans is one of the letters that Paul is unequivocal that women are and should be supported in senior leadership roles. So in chapter 16, Phoebe is named as an ordained deacon, right? So Phoebe is a congregational leader that Paul is commending to the Roman church and saying, please support her. Okay. In chapter 16, she's also named as a benefactor of Paul. So Paul seems to be somewhat indebted to Phoebe, and she is his co-worker. Likewise, we see Prisca, so Priscilla, again named as a co-worker of Paul. So Priscilla and Aquila are influential church leaders as a couple, but Priscilla is named first, right, in these lists, which means that Paul is not leaving any ambiguity that she's just tagging along to her husband's ministry. No, she is the primary minister there. He's tagging along. Lastly, Romans 16, verse 7, lists a woman named Junia as an apostle. He says, Junia, prominent among the apostles, right? So, at least at the time that Romans is being written, Paul says pretty clearly, there are women in leadership roles throughout the church. There are those in your church that I'm greeting. And Paul is, not condemning that practice. Okay, that's all I got for you. God bless.